On this episode of This Week in Linux, we have a big announcement from Ubuntu that is probably going to be a bit polarizing. We're also going to cover some other distro news from OpenMandriva, Alpine Linux, openSUSE, EndeavourOS, and Regolith Linux. Then we're going to check out some hardware news from Pine64 for the Pinebook Pro and Slimbook's new all-in-one PC. Later in the show, we'll take a look at some news from CERN, Netflix, Huawei, Mattermost, Wayfire, which is a new Wayland compositor, and more. So all that and much more is coming up. I'm Michael Tennell with Tux Digital, and this is your weekly source for Linux GNews. This episode of This Week in Linux is sponsored by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean offers the simplest, most developer-friendly cloud platform. It's optimized to make managing and scaling apps easy with an intuitive API, multiple storage options, integrated firewalls, load balancers, and more. You can get all this plus access to their world-class customer support for as low as $5 per month. DigitalOcean also has 2,000 cloud-agnostic tutorials to help you stay up to date with the latest open-source software, languages, and frameworks. You can get started on DigitalOcean for a month for free with a $50 credit by going to do.co/tux. That's do.co/tux. Again, you can get started on DigitalOcean with a $50 credit. So you can get an entire month for free with that $50 credit, so you can test all kinds of different droplets, and just by going to do.co/tux. And again, thanks to DigitalOcean for sponsoring this episode of This Week in Linux. Up first in the show is a pretty polarizing topic, and it is definitely the most hot topic of this week, and that is Ubuntu has announced that they're going to be dropping i386, aka 32-bit packages, from future releases, starting with Eon, Ermine, or Ubuntu 19.10. So, this is a interesting decision. Actually, I think it's a terrible decision, but there are some reasons to get rid of 32-bit packages in certain ways. There's certain scenarios where it does make sense, and there's also scenarios where, well, they shouldn't do that. So let's talk about some of the stuff that makes sense to do. So, for example, having 32-bit versions of a distro, like offerings of an ISO, would be a lot more difficult because it adds a lot of extra development time. It requires a lot of testers and users, but there's not that many testers and users, so it makes it complicated to offer that. So it makes sense that they would stop making ISOs, which they did last year, but still, it makes sense that they would do that. It also makes sense to drop 32-bit packages for most packages. There's really no reason to have a 32-bit package for Firefox these days. There's no reason to have one actually, you can't even have one for Chrome, period. So there's many reasons why you should get rid of the 32-bit packages for things that don't really have a reason to keep them. However, there is an important factor to keep 32-bit around, and that is the base libraries, or the baselibs. And the reason to do this is because it allows support for older software. It also allows support for games, because a lot of games these days, even if they're made native for Linux, they are still in a 32-bit format, and therefore they need 32-bit libraries in order to run. Now, this is not true for every game, but it is true for the vast majority of games. Probably around 80% of games are somewhat reliant on 32-bit. And Steam, for example, it requires 32-bit libraries to run the client and to run, well, most games. So baselibs are important, but this does seem to be that they are going to get rid of these packages entirely, including the baselibs. So the community did not respond to this very well. And when I say community, I don't mean community in the sense of the Linux community. I mean, yes, that's true. The Linux community did not respond very well, but also just the regular tech community, because people are talking about it in a variety of places, like Engadget, Gizmodo, Inquirer even. So there's a lot of places that are talking about it, and, well, it just breaks a lot of stuff with very little reason to do so, because I understand not supporting thousands and thousands of 32-bit packages. I get that. You can limit it down to the base libs, and by doing so, you're supporting maybe 250. Still quite a bit, but not thousands. So, it's ridiculous that they're even doing this, but let's get more in details, because there was a response from Steve Langasek, who was the guy who originally announced this on the mailing list. Will Cook is the person who put it on the discourse forum, but it was really announced on the mailing list. So anyway, he says, because of all this confusion and because of all this negative response towards this, well, he's responded with saying, "I'm sorry that we've given anyone the impression that we are dropping support for i386 applications. It is simply not the case. What we are dropping is updates to the i386 libraries, which will be frozen at the 1804 LTS versions." So, this is not a good response, because this is kind of like saying, this is, don't worry, we're not actually dropping it. We are just like freezing the version or whatever. Now, the problem with that is that is not acceptable either, because that won't work. If you take in 1804 libraries to the 1910 packages, the versions between the libraries for 64-bit and 32-bit will be incompatible, and therefore it doesn't matter that they're still there. They might as well not be there. So I don't think this is a valid response, because it doesn't solve anything. It's just pretending that it's not a big deal when it totally is. So Valve responded to this, not this particular message, but in the overall thing, basically the next day when they found out this was happening. Valve's developer, I'm not sure if Valve officially agrees with this developer statement, but Pierre Lou, aka Plagueman2, stated on his Twitter that Ubuntu 19.10 and future releases will not be officially supported by Steam or recommended to our users. We will evaluate ways to minimize breakage for existing users, but will also switch our focus to a different distribution, which is currently to be determined. So, this is not good. When I talked about the Gizmodo and the Engadgets and those types of things talking about it, they're talking specifically about the Valve statement, the Valve approach to it. Because Valve is saying that they're no longer going to be promoting or supporting Ubuntu. That's a huge damage issue for Ubuntu. It creates a problem in the sense that even new users, when they're typically suggested Ubuntu or Ubuntu base, because the idea is that it's easy to use those distros. But if they want to game, this decision makes that really hard, and it makes the answer for what's the easiest to use not be Ubuntu. So Valve is looking to try to use a different distribution, and the fact that the 1804 statement previously, the response from Steve, was not a valid response and doesn't change anything, it's still problematic. In fact, we actually got I found out, one of the things is that the talk about this was on the mailing list for a long time. But the mailing list typically had stuff about getting rid of the ISOs, and yeah, sure, go ahead. Getting rid of most packages, yeah, sure, go ahead. But everything, I don't know. That's a bit much. And most people don't look at mailing lists because, yes, those are public. Anybody can look at them. But, I mean, who cares? It's not the 90s anymore. Very rarely do people actually pay attention to mailing lists other than developers on them. However, in this case, after this happened, I looked at another mailing list, which was the Wine mailing list, and they did respond to this in their mailing list. And specifically, based on the 1804 versus 1904 packages, or 1910 packages, Roseanne DeMezio, wrote on the mailing list for Wine that the suggestion from Ubuntu is to use 32-bit packages, 32-bit libraries from 1804, which will be supported for 2023. It's theoretically possible to build the 32-bit side on the OBS using their build system, using the libraries from 1804, but that would lead to a mismatch in library versions. The 32-bit and 64-bit sides would be built against different versions. And then Roseanne says, apt requires the i386 and the AMD 64 versions of packages to match, or it will refuse to install them. So unless that changes, users of 1910 and up will be unable to install 32-bit libraries they need to run Wine. Well, they could just downgrade a significant part of their system to 1804 versions. I guess that's a solution too. But essentially, Roseanne is saying that the reason why the statement from Steve is not a valid statement and not doesn't change anything is because the mismatch version makes it not matter. Because apt can't install them or refuses to install them, it essentially breaks that response entirely because it breaks the system in the sense of support. It's also worth noting that Vincent Poverick from Codeweavers, also on the Wine mailing list, it actually hurts Wine in other ways, not just gaming, because Wine basically he's saying that basically all applications on Windows, whether they are 64-bit or not, use 32-bit installers. And the reason they do that is because it's useful for when 64-bit applications are being packaged on or being ran on 32-bit Windows computers, because they wouldn't be able to, the 32-bit Windows computer wouldn't be able to run the 64-bit installer, so they just default to using a 32-bit installer regardless. So even then, there's many ways that getting software, just in not even just games, but all kinds of different software in Wine would not work. So that creates another problem. And then also, Vincent talks about the idea between having 1804 packages on the 1910 system, because there was another thing that was mentioned in the frequently asked questions for this particular forum post, for the announcement, was that they could use LXD containers or some kind of containerized environment, like a Snap or something, to solve this problem. And yes, that is an option, not a very good option, but it's an option. And the response from Vincent on that particular topic says, this would use the 1804 packages in a Snap's environment. But since there's no expectation of long-term support for the environment containing those 32-bit packages, I can't see any point of putting as much effort as needed into this temporary solution. So, yes, you could do it, but there's essentially like 4 years of support. So the 4 years support inside of the Snap, inside of the container, is not a reasonable thing for them to spend the time to make it work when they know it's going to break at some point anyway. Like, what is the point of making it work with those packages when those packages are no longer going to be supported, creating or going right back to the same problem? So Canonical would not be supporting it, or Ubuntu would not be supporting it. So it's an unfortunate topic, and I understand that it's possible that they'll revert their decision. They'll keep the baselibs. Hopefully they do keep the baselibs. There's a benefit to doing that, but I don't. It's such a weird decision, and I don't get it. I don't know why they did this, because it just hurts themselves. There's no way they're gonna force Steam or Valve to rebuild their stuff or take over the libraries and stuff. It makes more sense for them to just switch to a different distro. Because their entire purpose of using Linux was to have support for all distributions, and that's why Valve coming to Linux was so awesome, because they did that. They made their own distribution called SteamOS, but that wasn't their focus. Their focus was to make every single game that works on SteamOS to work on Linux. They even specifically said that when game developers made their games to work on SteamOS, that if they did not work on regular Linux and completely, then it didn't count, it didn't work on SteamOS. So they took it to a degree of making sure that everything worked on whatever distro. So they can just jump to whatever distro and they would be fine as long as they create a partnership with whoever they jump to. And I think there's a potential that they will do that. I mean, they basically said it, and even if Ubuntu or Canonical changes their minds and doesn't get rid of the baselibs, I don't know if they can revert this decision, because their responses for why this is being done is, not acceptable, because they've now pulled back, saying that this is not really what we're doing. But the thing that they said that they're doing is not a solution either. It's also a bad idea. So I don't know. This topic could go on for a very long time. So I'm gonna go ahead and just end it there, I guess. If you would like to talk about it in the comments below, feel free to do so. I'd love to have it continue the conversation, or in the live chat, because I know there's going to be a lot of conversation about this particular topic. And yeah. Oh, by the way, I said I was going to move on, but I just wanted to point out other distributions I saw in the frequently asked questions. It says, well, other distributions have also dropped 32-bit packages. And yes, they have, but not the baselibs, in order to keep support for these things. Arch got rid of 32-bit, except baselibs. openSUSE Leap got rid of 32-bit, except for baselibs. So, yeah. Keep the baselibs, at least. The rest of it, feel free to get rid of, but keep the baselibs, because they're necessary. I don't know. If you don't, and you do go through the process, of getting rid of all 32-bit support, period, and you break gaming and you break support of using certain applications that are like industry-specific applications that are required for, servers or hospitals or government places or whatever, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. So I don't know why this isn't being done, but we'll see what happens. Ubuntu, don't do this. You're only hurting yourself. Anyway, moving on. So I was going to end it right there, but there was a good point made in the live chat that I wanted to address, and that was from the Peppermint developer. Mark Greaves said that they're not just hurting themselves. And the point he's making is that I completely agree. There's potentially that Ubuntu and Canonical are hurting Linux in general by making this decision, because if someone gets the information about Ubuntu is the most popular distribution, or Ubuntu is the easiest one to use, and then they try to play games and it doesn't work at all, that is going to put a very negative opinion of Linux in general by that reaction. That result will be very bad and very negative to the overall community, in fact. So unless somehow Ubuntu is dethroned as the number one distro for desktops usage, I agree. That is totally a good point, that it will hurt more than just themselves. It'll hurt themselves for sure, but also a little bit more. So that's unfortunate. It's interesting. I was having a conversation with some people on Discord last night, and it wasn't really about this, but it came up, of course. And JJ talked about something that was interesting, and I agree to a point, but the statement was basically, why is it that when Linux gets the opportunity to get any kind of advantage, we just shoot ourselves in the foot? And now this is applying to like when Windows 7 or when Vista came out, or when XP was out of or end of life, or when Windows 8 came out and 8.1 was still terrible. And we have all these different examples of when we could do things good, and then we just don't capitalize. And then now that Windows 7 is end of life next year, there's another opportunity. And the opportunity isn't that great because people still are willing to use Windows 10. But as soon as people realize that Windows 10 is a cesspool of privacy violations, it becomes an opportunity. So it's not as good as the Windows 8 debacle. It's not as good as the Vista debacle. But then we do this. I don't know. So all I could say is I hope that they revert this decision. And if they don't, best of luck to Ubuntu. But I have very high suspicion the result will not be good for you. If you want to learn more about this, there are thousands of topics and articles talking about it. You can find it, just search Ubuntu 32-bit, you'll find a ton. But I will have a link to the mailing list post and the forum in the show notes. In some positive news, OpenMandriva has released 4.0, codename Nitrogen. And OpenMandriva is a fork, or not a fork. Yeah, technically it is a fork. It's a derivative of Mandriva, which is a derivative of Mandrake. And so it has its roots all the way back to Mandrake. And it is a RPM-based distribution that is now making some interesting changes because they are using their compiler is not 100% Clang or Clang, but it is 98% of it. So that's pretty interesting that they're using that instead of the GCC and everything. But they're also utilizing Calamares as their installer, and they're focusing on KDE Plasma as the desktop environment, which is a good decision. And they have upgraded their kernel to 5.1.9. They've updated Xorg and Mesa drivers to not the exact latest one, but right before that. And the same thing with Plasma, that's not the latest one that just came out, but it's the one right before that. So they still have pretty up-to-date, even if it is not the latest thing. But they do have something that's pretty interesting with the latest release, is that they've switched their package manager to DNF from Fedora, because it is an RPM-based distro as being based on Mandrake. And the DNF package is, the DNF package tool is a much better tool than the URPMI or Yum or anything. Like DNF is a really good choice. It's pretty interesting, and I think that it's worth checking out if you haven't before, because it does have a lot of cool things that they keep up to date with, like the core features of the system. So if you are interested in checking out RPM distro, I think OpenMandriva is worth checking out. And so I have a link to it in the show notes if you'd like to check it out. Alpine Linux 3.10.0. If you haven't heard of it, Alpine Linux, they describe themselves as a security-oriented, lightweight Linux distribution based on Muzzle, libc, and BusyBox. So you'll notice that these listing of these options kind of imply that they're not GNU related distribution, as in they don't use GNU tools. And that is an interesting approach because Alpine is one of those distros that do not use GNU packages or stack in their distribution, and that could be a reason to use it for some people who might not like GNU. But there are also some interesting things that they're doing, in the sense that they have new features in this latest release, such as switching to IWD, which is an alternative for WPA supplicant for Wi-Fi, and also they've added support for serial and Ethernet support for ARM boards, and they are using the distributed object store and file system Ceph, as well as switching to the LightDM display manager, which is pretty interesting because LightDM has a lot of cool concepts behind it. At the same time, is they have a lot of lightweight approaches for it, and also some you can have a wide variety of options in LightDM, so that's pretty cool too. Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about Alpine Linux, I think it's definitely worth checking out. So I'll have a link to 3.10.0 in the show notes. Up next in the show is some interesting news from the openSUSE team, and that is that they are considering a differing approach to their governance, which also would be potentially a different branding of the name openSUSE. So they might be dropping the SUSE part, or they might just be completely, switching it up to something else. It's really completely up in the air. There's not really any news about any main decision, but I just think it's an interesting thing that they're talking about because of what benefits and negatives that could come from that. So in the marketing perspective and the branding perspective, I'm actually a marketer and designer, so I have a lot of experience in this particular topic. And they're in a situation where both decisions have valid value and also negative connotation too, in the sense that if they were to do it, they'd be able to have a separate foundation that would be able to take donations. They'd be able to organize events without SUSE involvement. They'd be able to do a lot of things that they're kind of limited in the way that they are now by using the SUSE name. They're limited to the trademarks and the restrictions of those trademarks, and how they are allowed to do things on behalf of SUSE because they're essentially representing SUSE. So by changing their name, they'd be able to do all those things and get rid of the situation of using that trademark. But at the same time, that trademark is also really big and powerful, so they have benefit to keep it. So there's both sides have pros and cons. So it's definitely an interesting discussion and debate that they're having about doing this. So they've been talking about it for a few board meetings recently about whether they're going to switch it or not, or what they're going to do with the potential of changing the name and that kind of thing. I think overall there would be very beneficial things to do to change the name, but they still would want to keep association to SUSE. And SUSE themselves said that they wouldn't be losing any kind of interaction with openSUSE. They would still be involved. They just wouldn't have the same branding. So despite seeking out a change in the governance, the Richard Brown, the chairman of openSUSE, and also the SUSE leadership themselves have said that they've reiterated the commitment that they have to each other, and making sure that the work is still interconnected. They just there might be a brand change. So this is very interesting, and I think that there's a lot of potential for the good and bad. But I think overall it'd probably be a good option for them to do it, because it allows them to have a lot more control and freedom in how they market and how they approach new partnerships and that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of potential in both sides, but I think I'm leaning towards more on changing it. To what, I don't know. There's a lot of different options. OpenGecko is an option. There's ReptileOS, something that's connected in some way to openSUSE. So those are suggestions from the chat, by the way. Well, Gecko Linux is already a thing, and that was listed in the chat too. But that'd be a good name if they didn't already exist. So Gecko Linux, that's a good one too, because Gecko is the name of the chameleon that they. Anyway, I think this is an interesting situation, and I will keep you up to date if there's any more news on this topic. But I think that if they do have a decision, it won't be anytime soon, because Richard Brown said that there's no real time pressure on this from any side right now, so it's really an organic growth thing, so they'll decide when it makes sense for both of them to do that. So it may or may not take, some time. It may happen some this year, may not happen this year at all, so who knows? But I do think that it is an interesting topic, and if we do get more information about this, I will cover it in a future episode of This Week in Linux. So if you'd like to have more information about this, I'll have a link to the LWN article about it in the show notes below. This episode of This Week in Linux is also brought to you by, you, the community, and specifically the patrons of the Tux Digital channel and the This Week in Linux podcast. So if you are not aware, being a patron gives a monthly donation or contribution to the Tux Digital channel as well as the podcast This Week in Linux, and allows me to spend more time creating content and working on the show. So whether that's $1 or whether that's $5 or whatever, anything at all is awesome. So if you would like to do that and help out the show, you can go to tuxdigital.com/Patreon, or you can go to tuxdigital.com/Sponsus to use the Sponsus platform rather than the Patreon. Depends on which one you like more. If you already have a Patreon account, then it makes sense to use that one. If you don't like Patreon, then Sponsus is another option to try out, because I think Sponsus is a pretty good system as well. So if you would like to become a patron, either one of those is great and will work just fine. But it is worth noting that there's a $3 minimum on the Sponsus because of how the transaction fees go, and the Patreon is a $1 minimum. But the reason for that is because they actually have now the same structure of transaction fees, but I have a grandfathered in account of Patreon, so they don't do that, so I can kind of pick and choose that sort of thing. Anyway, it doesn't matter, but it is worth noting that if you do want to use Sponsus, there is a section in the settings of your account that will say Stripe account, or putting in Stripe payment. So there's you don't actually need a Stripe account. When I first talked about Sponsus, I had people asking me, why do I need to make a Stripe account? You don't actually need to do that. That is for just creators. So if you want to be a patron to someone on Sponsus, you just put in your credit card information in that Stripe section, or the payment methods section, not an actual Stripe account. You don't need those. So just wanted to clarify that part. But if you would like to, donate to the channel and contribute as a patron to whether you're using Patreon or Sponsus, it would be very much appreciated. Actually, amazing, because it helps me make the content. And if you're not aware, making a podcast is a ton of work. I mean, if you just take in just This Week in Linux by itself, there's research, there's prep, there's trying to find the topics to cover, researching all the topics, prepping the show, recording the show, editing the show, publishing the show, and doing all the metadata and all that stuff. So there is a lot of work to do it, and any amount of money offered is incredibly appreciated. So if you would like to become a patron, I would very much appreciate that. So again, just go to tuxdigital.com/Sponsus or tuxdigital.com/Patreon to become a patron. Up next in the show is an interesting project that is coming from the end of Antergos. So we talked about this previously. Antergos had to announce that they were going to end their project and no longer make new versions, and that they were offering the code to be used by another project or the community in general. And we also talked about at the end of that segment that there was a project called Endeavor that was working on trying to make a project, and we're working on making a name and everything, but they decided to actually stick with the name Endeavor, so they were going to EndeavourOS. And this is interesting because the way that they're approaching this is pretty interesting. And so they're looking to take the place of Antergos essentially, but not only just in a spiritual successor, but also in the kind of a successor to what people thought Antergos was, rather than what it actually was. So most people that you talk to about Antergos, they would typically say that Antergos is an easy installer for Arch. But that's not what it really was. Yes, that is true. If you just use the base install, you essentially just got Arch. A little bit more of extra stuff like extra repos and stuff, but it was mostly Arch. However, if you picked any of the DEs, there was a lot of customizations. There was theme customizations. There was modifications of the layouts. There was like widgets installed. There was like custom icons that they got from the Numix team of creating like a partnership with them. There was like a lot of stuff that they did that created a situation where Antergos is no longer an installer. It is an installer and an extra layer on top, so it's effectively its own distro. So it is an interesting situation, whereas Endeavour is not exactly going to be copying Antergos. They're going to take the approach of being a successor in the sense that they're going to do basically what people thought Antergos was. They're going to provide a easy installer to Arch, but also add some extra, niceties and making it simple and how to like pick a DE and it will like automatically set up stuff. But what is really cool about this, one of the things I like is that they're very open to input. And I have suggested a few things, and they have looked into it and have decided to adopt some of the things I suggested. But I'm not going to go into details of like what all that was. But one of the things that they did say that they're going to do is have 10 different DEs that they're going to offer. Now, one of the things that I really wanted Antergos to do for a long time that they didn't ever do was to create an install that gave you the vanilla options from Arch. Now, I like the idea of having the custom theme, but also that's a lot of work. And I also don't really want a particular theme because I want to have a different design, a different approach. So I wanted the option to have a vanilla install from the Arch packages. So EndeavourOS is actually going to offer that as an option. So you will have the option to use a theme that they provide. Well, actually, they're not making it. They're just selecting a theme from the community, which is great because they're less work for them, but at the same time, they still make a nice polished look. But you can also choose to get the vanilla install instead, which is very cool because that means you could have the base setup of Arch very close to Arch, even though there might be some extra stuff here and there, but very, very, very close to Arch, even with like a nice GUI install. So that's pretty cool. Now, the distribution is currently in beta. Now, they've also been, I've actually tried it, and it does work fairly well for what they're trying to do, even though it's beta, but it is beta, so there are some issues, of course. But there are things that are also pretty interesting that they are doing another thing that the community for Antergos really wanted for a very long time that was never done, and that is an offline installer. So they're going to be doing 10 DEs that includes OpenBox, i3, GNOME, Budgie, Cinnamon, Deepin, Plasma, and a base install, which is essentially just the core, a core system install without any DE whatsoever, and some other stuff. And they're also going to be doing an offline installer, and those are all online net installs. And they're also going to do an offline installer for XFCE, a custom XFCE. So that is a pretty interesting approach because one of the things that people have been wanting was a vanilla install and an offline installer, and Antergos didn't want to do that at any point. But now, because Endeavour is taking over, kind of like the successor, they're going to be doing what the community has been requesting for a long time, which is really cool to see being done. Now, the website is still pretty much under development. This is the only thing that's on their website is the blog post, but they are going to be working on releasing their website and the new versions of the actual released version of the installer and the OS sometime in mid-July. I'm pretty sure it's July 15th, but there was some issues where they planned to do it on July 1st, but they had some issues that they had to take care of that pushed it back a little bit. So it's July 15th is what it's currently set at. And so far, my experience with it is that it's pretty impressive for how small amount of time they've been working on it and how much they're trying to do and what they're trying to do. And overall, I think the roadmap has a lot of potential. So I'll be definitely taking out EndeavourOS in the future. And when they do a release for EndeavourOS, I will definitely be covering it because I'm going to test it and let you know what I think about it, as well as what all the different options that they finally landed on and all that. So yeah, be sure to check out the show notes for a link to their blog post and also be sure to subscribe to get more information about this project when there is some. So, yeah, link in the show notes. Up next in the show is Regolith Linux. Regolith is an interesting distribution that is trying to do a combination of Ubuntu with i3. So if you have never heard of i3, it is a very popular lightweight tiling window manager that lets you easily move, arrange, and tile windows without having to leave your keyboard. So the idea is that it will automatically tile applications when you launch them into a workspace that will adjust and maneuver things like automatically. You can choose to move things around if you want to, and also you can even change it to a floating instead of tiling if you want, like most window managers typically are floating, but it allows you to do a lot of different things. So it's pretty interesting. And Regolith is being developed by Ken Gilmore and comes with a lot of interesting defaults in the sense that i3 has some really weird defaults, and this one actually comes with some more sane defaults. So that's nice to see. And then also, you don't. One of the best things about this particular project is that you don't have to replace your existing distro. You don't have to reinstall Regolith in order to use it. Or not reinstall, but you don't have to install the distro in order to use it. You can actually install a PPA and install the i3 Regolith environment as an alternate desktop environment or an alternate session. So that's pretty cool. And Regolith also comes with all the things that i3 users would like i3WM, i3 blocks, i3 bar, Conky, and Compton as a compositor if you want it. So there's a lot of things that are being done for this, and it's really interesting because I've been trying to find an i3 Ubuntu based for a very long time, so that's pretty cool that they're making it now. And if you would like to try your hand at it, and as my friend Ryan would say from Destination Linux, become an i3 prodigy, you can have a link in the show notes to Regolith Linux, and this might be a really easy way to get started to try out i3. Where most of the time getting i3 you have to require a different. There's not really an easy way in, but now there is. So if you are interested, I have a link in the show notes. Up next in the show is some information from the Pine 64 team, and that is the Pinebook Pro is getting some spec bumps. Now, not like huge bumps, but there are interesting bumps in the sense that they're going to improve the keyboard as well as improve the Bluetooth module. So you can get a support for Bluetooth 5.0. So that's pretty cool. And I really like the idea they're going to improve give you options for the keyboard. So you can have, depending on what kind of keyboard you want, that's cool. So for the most part, I just wanted to talk about this because I'm so excited about the Pinebook Pro. I can't wait till it actually comes out. We don't have a release date yet, unfortunately, but I am very excited about this. So I just can't wait. So I just want to talk about it again. Pinebook Pro is a really cool ARM laptop that is fairly cheap, but also pretty powerful. I actually have a Pinebook 1 or the Pinebook original. I don't really what the name of it. I think it's just called Pinebook. So Pinebook and then Pinebook Pro. And I have the Pinebook, and it is a surprisingly good piece of hardware for the price. It's only $100 to get the regular Pinebook, and it's only $200 to get the Pinebook Pro. But the build quality of the regular Pinebook feels like $100. And based on the statements of what Pine 64 is doing with the Pinebook Pro, that's not going to be the case for the Pinebook Pro. It's going to have a metal body, a chassis kind of stuff. It's going to have 4 gigs of RAM. It's going to have a 14.1 1080p IPS display. It's going to have a USB 3.0, 2.0 USB Type-C. It's going to have support for micro SD. It's going to have Wi-Fi plus the new Bluetooth 5. It's going to have a 10,000 milliamp battery, and I'm just so excited. Release it, I could get a review unit. I think that's a good idea. I should get a review unit. Pay for it, sure, why not? Just let me have early access. Maybe. If you'd like to learn more about this particular piece of hardware, I have a link in the show notes to their June update for their hardware. Also, the Pine phone. Super excited about the Pine phone and the Pine Tab too. I want all their stuff at this point. So, yeah. Up next in the show is some more hardware news, and that is from Slimbook. They've announced a new all-in-one Linux PC. And this one is a very interesting thing in the sense that it has some pretty good specs, but also in the sense that it looks surprisingly, uncannily well, anyway, uncanny to an Apple product. So it looks like the iMac, they're very similar in how the iMac was made. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because it does look pretty good, and having the hardware being pretty good also is a good sign. And at the same time, because it's not actually an Apple, you can, update it and use it properly and not have to worry about it, not being supported in the next, year and a half. So there's that too. But this hardware is being named Apollo, and it has an aluminum alloy body for the build quality, so that's pretty good. And they also have the structure. This is like the specs of the computer, and it's a 23.6 inch LCD IPS monitor. They're going to have it's a high definition panel, which is interesting because they have an extra coating on the glass for a retina effect. I don't really know what that means, but it's interesting because it's going to gives color pops or something like that. So I'm curious what that might look like. So maybe if they have a video, I couldn't find a video demonstrating that, but hopefully they make one. There's also going to have support for the 8th gen Intel i5 and i7 processors. It's going to have 8 to 32 gigabytes of RAM as options, and up to a 1 terabyte SSD is going to be available as well. And it's going to have onboard Intel graphics. So it is kind of expensive though. It's $800 to get the i5 version, and it's $799 and $899 to get the i7 version. So it is kind of expensive for that kind of hardware. But at the same time, it is very sleek, and maybe that's worth it. I don't know. It depends on the person who's ordering, of course. But I would like to say that it is, really nice looking hardware, and it is really cool that these companies are using, building stuff specifically for Linux that's really looking nice, because we used to have the options of doesn't have Linux, looks really nice. Does have Linux, kind of weird and bulky. Now we're getting more and more, like the Dell XPS, the Slimbook all-in-one. The Slimbook also has the actual Slimbook is a really nice, clean laptop. Then we're getting the Pinebook Pro, which is going to be a really nice, clean ARM laptop for Linux. It's really exciting to see these companies build, high quality and really nice looking hardware for Linux these days. So, great for that, and thank you for participating in that part of the industry and the community and everything. So if you'd like to learn more about this particular PC, I'll have a link to it where you can buy it in the show notes from Slimbook, and have a link to it in the show notes. How much is the stand? Oh man. I wish I had seen that joke before I finished the talk or the section. And the stand is not $1,000. So, it's only. Well, they could say you could say it's $900, but the stand comes for free. Up next in the show is some really great news for Mattermost. If you've not heard of it, Mattermost is a open source alternative to Slack, and Slack is a cloud-based team collaboration software it's pretty popular. It uses it's like an internal team communication software, and it's heavily used for startups, enterprises, and even some open source projects use it a lot too. So it's really interesting that Mattermost is doing that, is building. They've been working on it for 5 years or so, and it's very robust in what it can do. And they have announced that they have gotten a funding series for the Series B funding from venture capitalists for $50 million to build out more of Mattermost. So in comparison to the main player in this space, which is Slack was valued recently at $20 billion. So in comparison, that's not a lot, but in the sense of an open source project, $50 million is gigantic. So what they can do a lot of stuff, and they can ramp up. They said they're essentially going to do the same thing they were already doing with the open source team collaboration or team communication system. They're still going to continue doing that, but they're going to ramp it up even more and do faster, add more features, which is awesome because you don't have to pay for their enterprise hosted version if you would like to host it yourself, because it is open source, and that is awesome. And this is a Really interesting piece of software. There's a lot of cool features of it. There's even other side projects that connect to it that I like as well. There's a lot of good stuff. And the prices for the enterprise hosted version, the E10 and E20, are actually roughly about half the price compared to Slack's service. So if you did want to use it in an enterprise level, then you could do so without having to host it yourself and still save a significant amount of money there too. So that's pretty cool. It's like $3.25 per person per month, which, depending on how many people you have in your team, that could be a lot of money. But you can also just open source it or use the open source version and use it that way. But it's really cool that they were able to get this amount of funding, but they were also able to get $20 million funding for their Series A in February, as well as a few seed round stuff from a couple years ago. So they've been able to raise basically $70 million in the past couple months or so. So there's a lot of potential for this particular project based on this funding. I don't know how much involvement the Y Combinator and these venture capitalists have, but Y Combinator is one of the few that is the one. It's like they focus on helping startups and helping open source projects. So seeing them doing it is less of a problem as far as the venture capitalist part. But I would like to see what benefits these people get from their funding. But anyway, I do think it's awesome, and Mattermost makes a lot of good stuff, and it is a very solid option for a Slack alternative if you would like to. And so I would definitely suggest it. There's a few of those. Matrix is kind of one. Rocket Chat, Mattermost, and there are a couple others, but I think Mattermost is so far the most well polished of the options. As a single project entity. So, like for example, with Matrix, you need to use Riot in order to use it, or as Rocket Chat is not as polished, as featureful as Mattermost. So that's the kind of thing. But Mattermost, it's really interesting to have all these different open source options. But I think if you're going to just make a Slack alternative for the purpose of being a Slack alternative, Mattermost is a great option. So I have a link to this blog post as well as Mattermost itself in the show notes below. Up next in the show is a new project called Wayfire. Wayfire is actually going to be kind of bringing some Compiz effects to Wayland. It is a compositor for Wayland that adds a lot of cool stuff. And the fact that it's still in basically pre-alpha, like they're calling it pre-alpha quality, and only supports basic stuff or basic functionality, they actually do have quite a few things that are pretty cool that are, I would not say are basic things, but we'll get to that in a second. So far they have support for workspace previews like the expose mode and stuff like that, as well as grid and auto snapping of windows on the edges. Wayfire. So they describe themselves as a 3D Wayland compositor built on the WL Roots project, and it supports workspaces, configurable bindings. It's currently working on a variety of different visual elements, and they say that X Wayland should have already have support for it with the compositor, and Wayfire is currently tackling some like tiling window support through like sway, window rules, on-screen keyboard support, and many more things. So those are the kind of the basic things, but they're also doing some stuff like adding wobbly windows effects and stuff like that. So there's quite a few things, including window snapping and even the 3D desktop cube. So bringing back the cube from like the Compiz days on Wayland. So that's pretty cool. The cube itself is not really that useful, but it's cool that they're working on bringing those kinds of features to Wayland because that's just cool in general. It also is worth noting that KWin has support for this stuff too. I'm not really sure how much of that support is on Wayland, but you can do all most of the stuff you can do in Compiz is also available with KWin. So there's that. But it is pretty cool that Wayfire is bringing this stuff to Compiz or to Wayland as an option for a compositor, because I definitely don't need the desktop cube, but I do like to play with it. So because it is kind of fun, even if it is ridiculous and worthless and whatever. But anyway, it is still kind of fun. So if you'd like to learn more about Wayfire, I have a link to it in the show notes. Up next in the show, CERN has announced that they're leaving Microsoft behind to switch to open source software. Now, they've actually been working on this for a little bit, like about a year or so, but they are officially going to be doing it fairly soon. So CERN is an international research center. If you've not heard of it, you've probably heard of it in the sense of like the CERN particle accelerator that they did and are still doing really. But they've been using a combination of open source as well as Microsoft products, and they've decided that they're going to leave as much possible behind of the Microsoft stuff because of the licensing fees that's going to be coming to them because of some weird changes that Microsoft has decided to do. So CERN is using open source mostly. Today they use it on their desktops, on a lot of open source in general, but they used Windows on their desktops. So that's one of the things that they're going to be changing significantly. And this is kind of weird because Microsoft is deciding to increase their licensing fees by like a factor of 10. So 10 times more of what they already currently pay. And it's because they decided to remove their classification as like a school, or like they had some kind of partnership with, not really a partnership, they had a deal with Microsoft that they'd pay like institution fees and or like school fees rather than the full price. But now Microsoft has decided to remove that benefit from them and increase the price drastically. So they decided to completely get rid of Microsoft in order to go to open source. Now they've said they're going to get rid of it, but it's going to be a process kind of thing. So that's really awesome, and I think that it's definitely something that pretty much every single company and institution and research thing should do because it just makes the most sense. So I'm glad to hear that CERN is doing that because it is an important research center in just in general. So like the stuff they're doing for science is really useful, and it's really nice to hear that open source is going to be allowing them to do that. So yeah, if you'd like to learn more about this particular thing, I'll have a link to the blog post from the CERN website in the show notes. Up next in the show is some unfortunate news, but not as bad as it's kind of been played out to be. It's some information from Netflix has been released, as they have released some security notices for CVEs and some TCP bugs for potential denial of service attacks. Now, this is an interesting situation because this affects Linux and FreeBSD, and it's not like catastrophically bad. It's just it would allow a attacker to give you very, very annoying issues. So the vulnerabilities specifically relate to the maximum segment size, or MMS, and the TCP selective acknowledgement, aka SAC, capabilities. The most serious one is called SAC panic, and it allows a remotely triggered kernel panic on recent Linux kernels. So essentially what it is that this situation can lead to a kernel panic via integer overflows, and it allows them to denial of service attack and also take down services. So it's not really that big of an issue because it is already been addressed, so you just need to update your systems. But it is important to note that they do have one severity that is listed as important, while the other two are listed as moderate. However, what's the reason why it's not as severe? Because people will say like there's going to be a patch, of course, always, and that's true. And in this case, it's also true, but there's also a mitigation technique so that even if your system is not updated that fast, if you have an LTS release or something like that, you might not get your kernel that fast to get the patch. There is a mitigation that's really easy to do and takes very little time, and also is super simple. It's basically one line of code or one command line. You just put it in a terminal, run it, and you're mitigated. So I'll have a link to the advisory notice from Netflix, as well as in the show notes I'll have the list of what you need to do as far as how to mitigate it, so that you can do that as soon as possible. So yeah, if you want to learn more about this, I'll have a link to all that in the show notes. Up next in the show is the NSA is looking to contribute to Coreboot. Now, if you're not aware, the NSA is the National Security Agency of the U.S. government, and they are looking to develop or to contribute to the Coreboot project. Specifically, Eugene Myers of the NSA under Information Assurance Research, and also the NSA/CSS Research Directorate, has been leading some work on the STM-PE implementation for Coreboot. So the STM is the implementation for SMI Transfer Monitor to offer protected execution services on Ex86 by serving as a hypervisor, in X86 SMM mode. Now, this is actually kind of worth noting because it is. I'm kind of putting in there because it's NSA kind of stuff, and yes, the NSA is horrible. But in some cases, that there's some things that could be done properly. For example, the source code is open, and in order to be in Coreboot, it has to be audited by the Coreboot team. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because this code has actually been worked on for a while, for like a year or so. But the code is actually under review right now from the Coreboot team, whether it's going to be included or not. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is going to be a bad thing, because if you've ever heard of SE Linux was actually in part made by NSA, not completely, but in part was made by the NSA. So there are things that they have contributed to the project and to the community that's not necessarily horrible. However, it is the NSA, so it's just kind of like, if you are a code auditor, or you're good at security and you'd like to make sure that this code is in the Coreboot, this is just an opportunity I wanted to bring up to see if you would like to check that out, because it might be necessary. Who knows? Anyway, if you'd like to learn more about this particular thing, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Up next in the show is some interesting news from Huawei, that they have now a potential alternative for Android. Huawei is not had a great year recently, with the U.S. government banning them for being involved in any U.S. companies, and the issues caused with that because of Google and their Android smartphones. And Huawei is pretty sure it was, at one point it was the second biggest, but if you count manufacturer, but if you count the low-end hardware, it became the number one Android company, smartphone maker company. And they've had a lot of issues to deal with recently. Some of it fair, some of it not clear, but it's not about necessarily Huawei in that sense, because we talked about in a previous episode. If you'd like to learn more about that, I have a link in that in the show notes. But this is actually pretty interesting, because they've been contemplating about how they're going to get rid of Android, and what are they going to use to replace it. And it appears that they're exploring something called Aurora OS, and it's actually based on Selfish OS we've talked about previously in another episode, that is made by the Yola company. And the reason why they're doing it is because it has a very heavy focus on privacy and security, which is interesting because of the allegations about Huawei. So anyway, many companies have tried and failed to launch an alternative to Android and iOS. And in this case, it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because Huawei doesn't really have a choice. They have to do this. And it'll be interesting to see what the outcome of this is, and whether or not using something like this would work. Because Selfish OS does say they have support for Android applications, and therefore maybe that's why they're using something that's based on that. So there is some potential there, and I'm very curious to see what happens with them. So they're going to have to deal with whether they can have the apps or not, and if they do have the ability to use those apps, it might be a good option for them. So anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens, because it's pretty interesting, and I will keep you up to date on the show when we find out more about their future, I guess. Yeah. So link in the show notes to this particular article if you'd like to learn more. Finally, this week in this show, I have not talked about Humble Bundle in a very long time, and I wanted to talk about it because there's a really interesting book bundle that's coming out right now, or is currently out right now, and it is a programming book bundle. So if you've ever been interested in programming, there's a variety of different types of languages that you could check out through this bundle, and you can get up to 25 different books for $15 or something like that. And some of the languages you can learn in this bundle is Python, Go, C++, Java, JavaScript, and if you want to, for some reason, C# and .NET, and some other ones as well. So if you're interested in checking that out, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. And also want to let you know that the link in the show notes is an affiliate link to the Humble Bundle. So if you do purchase it, a small percentage of the purchase will go to the This Week in Linux podcast, as well as the Tux Digital channel, to help fund in the creation of this show. So, if you're interested in checking it out, I have a link in the show notes. And if you are interested in checking it out, please use that link, because it will benefit the show. So, link in the show notes. Thanks for watching this episode of This Week in Linux. If you like what I do here on this show, please like that smash button and be sure to subscribe. If you'd like to support the Tux Digital channel, we have multiple ways to contribute via Patreon, Sponsus, PayPal, and others. You can learn more by going to tuxdigital.com/contribute. Or you can order the Linux is Everywhere t-shirt by going to tuxdigital.com/Linux is Everywhere. Or if you're in Europe, you can go to tuxdigital.com/LinuxEverywhereEU for shipping inside of Europe. We also have ways to contribute without any cost to you by using our affiliate links. You can find links for places like Amazon, private internet access, and many more by going to tuxdigital.com/affiliates. If you liked some more podcasting goodness from me, then check out the latest episode of Destination Linux, as I'm a co-host of that show. And just a reminder, this show is live usually every Saturday, sometimes not Saturday, sometimes Sunday, which is this time. But for the most of the time, it's usually Saturdays and usually every Saturday, but not always, because sometimes I'm at a conference and then I'm not doing it live. So join us in the live chat room to discuss all the latest Linux GNews each week. Thanks again for watching. I'm Michael Tennell with Tux Digital. And as always, keep using, learning, and enjoying Linux.